Welcome to Be With Champions. I'm your host, Greg Bennett. Today's chat was fascinating. My guest, Bryce Wylde, is an encyclopedia of everything around health and everything that we need to optimize our overall health daily. I love the detail in which he discusses what supplements we should all be taking, from omega-3, vitamin D3, vitamin C, vitamin E, cortisone, suntheanine, and glycine from Continual G for glutathione, amongst others. The show notes and timestamps are at bennettendurance.com/media. And this episode of all the episodes, you may need these or you might need your own notepad and pen. Just a simply wonderful chat. If you're enjoying the show, please subscribe and share, and please keep their feedback coming on the social media channels. Mine is Instagram, Greg Bennett World, or on Twitter, Greg Bennett 1. Or you can go to iTunes and give feedback there. But I can't get back to you on iTunes, but I do read them, and I really appreciate the feedback. Thanks for listening. This one is a wealth of useful knowledge. Enjoy. Before we start, I've got to give a quick shout out to the brands that make this show possible. The only brands I'm working with are brands that provide products that I use daily and truly believe in. These products support my immunity, they help improve my recovery and my focus. First up, my friends at Athletic Greens. I love this company and I love their all-in-one daily drink. It's become a part of my morning routine. I'm heavily focused on supporting my immunity and boosting my energy and helping my gut health, but I want to do it naturally. And I found that support with Athletic Greens, a whole food sourced green drink that tastes great and there's no hassle. It's delivered straight to your door. And it's a highly absorbable powder that takes seconds to mix with water, so there's no clumpiness to deal with. I can't believe a green drink sourced from whole foods can actually taste so good. Personally, I truly love it. It's developed from a complex blend of 75 vitamins and minerals. It's packed with adaptogens for recovery, probiotics and digestive enzymes for gut health, and vitamin C and zinc citrate for immune support. So Athletic Greens is designed to help fill the nutritional gaps in your diet. And there's a great offer going on now for you to give it a try. Simply go to athleticgreens.com/Greg to claim our special offer of 20 free daily travel packets with your first order. $79 added value. And get Athletic Greens delivered straight to your door. Again, that's athleticgreens.com/Greg. This show is also brought to you by my friends at Hyperice. Some of these products I've been using for almost a decade. Makers of the award-winning Hypervolt, the world's most powerful percussion massage device featuring Quiet Glide technology. Hyperice is a wellness tech company that makes devices designed to help you move better. From handheld massage devices to vibrating foam rollers, thermal technology, and the Normatec compression systems, Hyperice helps you warm up faster, recover quicker, and simply move better. Used in professional training rooms throughout the NBA, the NFL, MLB, the MLS, Ironman, and other professional organizations for well over a decade. Designed to help improve circulation, flexibility, and relieve tension. Get $50 off all percussion devices now, no code needed, and get an additional 10% off with code GREG10 at hyperice.com. That's hyperice.com, HYPERICE.com, and use code GREG10 for 10% off. All right, today's guest is an alternative medicine expert. He's a clinician, television host, educator, author, and philanthropist. His specialty is homeopathy, clinical nutrition, supplementation, and botanical medicine. His focus is rooted within functional medicine. He blends the latest in human biology and genomic screening, science and technology, and uses new, traditional, and ancient remedies. I'm excited to have on the show one of the world's leading alternative health experts. Welcome, and thanks for joining me on Be With Champions, Bryce Wylde. How are you, mate?
Hey, Greg, thanks so much for having me on. I'm excited to be on the show. Love what you're doing. Love what you've done. Love where this is all going. And once again, I appreciate it. If I may, just to start off, and this just, doesn't quite get under my skin, but it is something that I like to tout and promote. And that is a review of nomenclature. So for so long, I've been revered as the alternative medicine expert, but we got to move away from that. And here's why. And I'm still, I'm still quite, accepting of the title. But anytime I get a chance, like I'm doing now, I like to start off, a short interview, sort of just reviewing this terminology. So at once, we were to find alternative. This is bringing the East into the West and a whole review of what we've been doing in what we call conventional medicine in the West here, by perhaps a blend of traditional Eastern wisdom. And then we were affectionately referred to as complementary alternative experts. Complementary because in many practices, it would complement an existing, pre-existing conventional, quote unquote, practice, using the wisdom, again, of westernized medicine. More recently, though, what we'd like to pick up is this functional medicine term. And really what functional medicine is just, the appreciation of the biochemistry, the genetic, the environmental, the virtual and, as well as non-virtual predispositions of the individual. So, taking all that into consideration and then just using best practice. Mm-hmm. So in my personal clinical practice, there is no time that I'm shy to use conventional wisdom, laboratory analysis, or for that matter, pharmacologics. Case in point, we see a lot of Lyme disease cases. I'm not sure, how rampant that is by you, but certainly in the northeastern seaboard here in North America, it's tremendous. And it's a very complex presentation. Conventional wisdom, however, approaches this as a 2-week doxycycline, and then see you later. Let's follow up in a couple of months. We, however, in a functional medicine practice would want and encourage the use of these very broad spectrum antibiotics for many months. And that might sound counterintuitive, like, wait a second, what's the alternative? There isn't. You use very high dose broad spectrum antibiotics, but then you complement it using probiotics, using those things that we otherwise term as biofilm busters to get right in there to the bacteria that's offending from, the Lyme tick. So that's just sort of a broad, very high line overview around, so this new sort of, and think about this for a second. What is alternative? Alternative, by definition, is use this as sort of an instead of or last ditch sort of scenario. Whereas we'd like to see this as, conventional medicine is actually the alternative when good nutrition, exercise, supplementation, and using therapeutic ingredients. When that doesn't work, let's employ the alternative of pharmacopoeia and surgery. So it's this whole review and flip around of this nomenclature.
I love that. The first note I have right here, in quotes, is alternative health or alternative medicine. I'm like, that's the first thing I want to discuss. And so you actually just went straight at it. And it was the first thing, because I've got after that, preventative health, functional medicine, natural medicine, all of these things. And why are we still saying that? And I must admit, when I introduced you as, alternative medicine expert, well, that was largely taken off your website. So
that's right.
I was kind of like, I don't know that I wanted to lead with that, because I think it is, I'm very interested in that, that we even talk about that, because I think it is this, even when we're sitting now and with the world sort of at a standstill and everybody's freaking out about, COVID and what's happening next. And I kind of feel like we're missing the real discussion, which should be on building immunity and how do we become more resilient and stronger. And I believe in us far more than I think the media and the governments are portraying. I believe in the human body and our ability to be stronger than what they're saying. But I'm interested to hear your thoughts on that.
Well, absolutely. And first of all, I think we're missing the most important pandemic, and it's being misrepresented in the media, being described as comorbidities and or predisposition to COVID. Your predisposition to experiencing a negative outcome, including death from COVID, is because you're obese, you have hypertension or diabetes, or all three. Metabolic syndrome. Those aren't comorbid. Well, they are comorbidities. You want to get technical, but what they are is representative of the true pandemic. Mm-hmm. And that's been in existence for many decades. We've been ignoring these trends up, and largely based in, diet, dietary, nutritionally from a macronutrient perspective, demonizing and vilifying fats, and spending all kinds of money to promote refined carbohydrates and sugar. Maybe we'll get into that a little bit later. But this root of in the shift toward this pandemic in obesity and diabetes and metabolic syndrome is ultimately what is, the root of how we are not able to manage coronavirus. I mean, it's not so novel. It's really only about 73% similar, and therefore about 27% dissimilar to previous coronaviruses. We should be able to manage this. We should be. And by the way, you look at the younger generation, and again, this is just to reiterate what you and your listeners already know, they're not being affected. Nor really is the older healthy generation. What is being affected are those individuals who are immune compromised, and that does happen with age. We could talk about that as well, naturally to some degree, and ways to boost that. But these individuals who are already set to pretty much kick the bucket from anything that would hit them, and yet we're calling it in most cases, whether it's medically responsible or not, due to impetus, both financial and otherwise, to call deaths from COVID when they're probably really other things.
I couldn't agree. I think I sit at at the moment we're spending a lot of time with my in-laws, and my father-in-law is 79, going on 80. Is still a triathlete, still mad about the sport of triathlon, still wakes up every morning and does his swim, bike, and running.
Brilliant.
His diet could do a little better. He still enjoys some of his refined carbohydrates, but generally speaking, he eats very, very well. And he's not concerned at all. And it seems to be the white older men don't seem to care too much about the COVID thing. I think they feel like they've been through far worse and they're kind of like over it. But I look at him and I go, well, that's just a fine example of, rather than looking at chronological age, I'm looking at his immunity age. And when I had Dr. Tommy Wood on the show a few weeks ago, and we had this same discussion, and Tommy talked about, he'd written a paper about future pandemics and how we prepare. And it's exactly what you're saying. Let's prepare by focusing on the real pandemic. What is it? And at its core, it's, look, through the 70s, 80s, and 90s and noughties, we were preached fat is bad. We were preached, let's eat, the old pyramid nutrition thing and everything else. That's what we were told. And so it's hard to point fingers, take any blame or anything else. It's just the education wasn't there. Now we're coming around 180 degrees. Let's reshift that pyramid type look at nutrition, and let's figure out what foods are right for us. And I do want to go into that a little bit with you. There's so many topics I want to discuss with you because it's just so brilliant to have someone like of your ability and understanding on the show. So, but before we do, give us a little bit of an understanding of where you come from and why this area is close to your heart and what you've made your life.
Oh, yeah, sure. So I was well on track to start a career in clinical psychology. I spent a couple of years at the time was called I live in Toronto, Canada. At the time was called the Queen Street Mental Health Center and Hospital. And those days, and we were talking, the late 80s, early 90s, those were pretty dreary days for psychology and psychiatry. I mean, you think about sort of this lime green painted wall and those who had been diagnosed with schizophrenia smoking in the corners and, kind of one flew of the cuckoo's nest, type thing. So, having done some occupational therapy and outpatient care, I quickly realized this was not what I thought it was going to be. But I stumbled across, I wrote about this in my first book, I stumbled across in the library barracks, the storage facility in this hospital, how in the mid 50s and even earlier, the use of certain natural remedies and homeopathics were used in conjunction. And so there's another perfect example of sort of a functional approach at the time, psychotherapy. And I thought, wow. And so, I grew up in a single parent family home. Actually, my mother was well ahead of her years. We were, eating, nutritionally and organically, and we had compost in the backyard and growing our own veggies and, bike riding whenever we could instead of using the family car, like all that stuff. But before recycling was even a name, she was doing all these things. And our next door neighbor of Australian descent, in the family of 12, very wonderful people. Anytime my mother had an issue with us, cold or flu or some minor issue, of course we had a family doctor, but any sort of small medical issue, she'd call on the Cossachecks and sort of ask their input. And it would either be, mustard plaster, on the chest, or, drinking back some cayenne pepper and water, all kinds of what I at the time, because I I revered myself even back then as scientifically minded. I would always contest, what my mother was talking about or what my mother was getting from our next door neighbor. But it grew on me, and I saw that no matter how maybe illogical or often we do the right thing but for the wrong reasons. Or sometimes the opposite, we do the wrong thing for the right reasons. But nonetheless, these things weren't working. And my mother was quite balanced. So if we had a real significant medical issue, of course, off to the family doctor we would go. So that was my upbringing. That was my exposure. This experience at this mental health facility that kind of changed things around. This was almost kind of, when I came across this literature in the library, I was convinced I had to go back. And so I did. I went back to school and got a degree in natural medicine, and I've been just educating myself. I've been a student ever since. As often as I possibly can to take a continuing ed course in this field and applying it. And I mean, I've got two wonderful children now who I've proven this model through as well, a 15-year-old boy and a 13-year-old girl. And, what this is about is using what you can from nature. And when I say that, I don't just mean picking herbs in the garden. I mean, using our bodies the way we're supposed to. We're meant to, push, pull, jump, squat, and lift. We're meant to eat micronutrient dense foods. We are meant to unplug from, technology. In fact, we're not really meant to use technology if you consider, from an evolutionary perspective, how such a short blip on the time continuum technology has been. And we're meant to get out into nature and expose ourselves to negative ions found in forests. And we're meant to ground ourselves, and we're meant to talk amongst ourselves. And that's a big issue, by the way. At the top, we were just sort of briefly describing this current COVID. I affectionately referred to this, by the way, as a COVID concussion, where if you think about it, although we haven't been knocked in the head, what we have been is socially isolated. We've been discombobulated. We've now got problems sleeping. We're overeating again, some of the wrong foods. We're not getting the exercise that we typically we were getting. So all these things have led to basically a syndrome similar to a concussion. But one of the biggest issues is the desocialization. And I've always been this proponent when it comes back to semantics again. This is maybe in the short term necessary to physically distance, but boy, does that term social distance ever get under my skin. Can't stand it. So all these things that, we're actually becoming sicker by the day. And by the way, just as we talked about, alluded to at the top, we'll get into this maybe deeper, is the idea of immune dysfunction occurring from lack of exposure to microbes. We're meant to be exposed to a diversity of microbes. That's the only way that our inherent the immune system we're born with ever learns. It learns through exposure. And so I know I digress a little bit, but at the my getting to where I am was from a combination of experience of upbringing, along with realizing, just before a career in clinical psychology was to start, that it wasn't for me, going back to my roots, literally and figuratively, and starting a career in natural medicine, just getting people to become healthier by showing them and educating them as to how their bodies, under the right circumstances, do everything that they need to do to stay healthy. You feed it well, and you exercise, and you keep a good mindset. And sometimes people just need these reminders of what they already know. So you combine all of that with, and this is really where I excel, clinical and biochemical laboratory technology. I mean, I leverage the best in technology and science. So things like, blood, urine, hair, saliva sampling, along with genetics, and personalize an approach that the individual. This is true functional medicine or personalized medicine, that it's the N of one. So I've never seen the same situation in my office ever. I don't care what kind of diagnoses an individual has been given. I might see 25 people with a term chronic fatigue syndrome, but treat them entirely differently. There are some sub-themes that carry themselves through, some commonalities, but often I'll find underlying issues that result in this, medical term diagnostic, but not really relevant.
It's a fascinating area that you're in then. So every client that comes in, you really treat differently. So it's always a different way of approaching and using all the tools in your toolbox, trying to figure it out and help them on their way. And I love when you mentioned socialization almost versus the isolation and the effects on our sort of metabolic health. I think this has been a topic of conversation I've had with my mum, who's back in Sydney on her own after our dad passed last year. And Australia's come down pretty hard on some isolation and things. And it has been one where she's a very social person. And she's continued to try and have people over every day and be around other people as much as possible. But I think for her, she's in that age demographic that they talk about, the mid-70s and blah, blah, blah. And she's like, well, hang on, I've had my turn and I don't intend to be dying isolated if I'm going to die. And she plays by the rules, but at the same time, it's this, no, I know that for my own health, I need to be around people. And we've discussed that over and over again. Every time I call her kind of every day or two via FaceTime and everything else that we have technology for, which I agree with you. I think it can be overdone as well. We need to distance ourselves from technology a little bit, but it has been good to have.
No question.
Just before we go on, just so people understand our background, I think we first probably met 6-7 years ago at a trade show, probably Supply Side West or somewhere out there in the nutraceutical world. And we were working with Bioenergy Ribose, who were a supporter of ours for a long time as athletes. D-Ribose is the product that they were using and we still use now. And that's kind of where we've met. And I think we've worked a couple of times since. I know my wife Laura's reached out to you a number of times with our kids and other things. So you've been a great support for us for a long, long time. So again, I appreciate you being here. And what I want to do now is just sort of step through some areas that we can all sort of get some real great takeaways and from this podcast. And I want to start with nutrition. And I think this is a great place to start because I think we can go into supplementation and all the bits and pieces following this. I guess let's just go into it. Real food, eat like our grandparents. It's not that easy these days. What are your thoughts on how do we optimize ourselves in trying to eat real food? What does that mean? And let's go from there.
Sure. So just to preface, what I'd like to suggest is, although we might get into some great detail here, at the end of it, when it's all distilled down, what I have to say is actually not difficult to implement at all. It's some few cardinal rules. It's, lending from the evidence and scientific literature and what we know essentially about evolutionary biology. I really am a huge proponent of a Paleolithic style of eating with some leeway. So that's why I use the term style. There's definitely exceptions to that rule, but generally, if we understand how our ancestors ate and how the hundreds of millions of years that have led up to our biology and our biochemistry, and more recently, over the past few million years, a couple of single, genetic mutations that have occurred to allow us to be who we are essentially today, and the brains that we have and the bodies that we have. That if we can appreciate that evolutionary biology and sort of simply follow a few cardinal rules, that most of us will be back to at least optimal form from nutrition. Now, I will also use this sort of caveat. I tell this to my patients all the time. Once you now have a medical problem or condition, it is very difficult to eat yourself healthy. So what I mean by that is not to say that you shouldn't optimize nutrition throughout your entire, recovery. And once you're optimal, maintain that optimal nutrition that's often personalized for you. But extracting ingredients and taking out nutrients from food to therefore create therapeutic range, that's my area of expertise. That's essentially what I do 9 times out of 10 with somebody. And so that's something that's difficult to get to through diet alone. So to your point about eating like our grandparents, I would actually suggest that you eat only foods that you would imagine literally presenting to your great-great-grandparents. And so that they would recognize that food, and then that would be your, that would be your go ahead to eat that food. So what I mean is that if they didn't know ultimately what this packaged Twinkie was, or a can of Coke, let alone how to open these things, or a McDonald's hamburger, so basically this is one of the first cardinal rules. So it's packaged, processed, packed with sugar, vegetable oils, preservatives. And of course, this is the most important thing to keep in mind, because everyone can be their own judge for this. If it's micronutrient devoid, then avoid it. And actually, one of my favorite, he's a prolific writer on the theme of nutrition, Michael Pollan. I'm sure you've heard of him, New York Times bestselling author. I like his slogan the best. He says this. He says it's a 3-part slogan. Simple: eat food. And what he means by that is real food. I mean, from the garden from Mother Earth, and organic if possible. Maybe we get into that. But eat food, not too much. Okay, and that's just being reasonable, right? And mainly plants. And he's not this advocate of veganism, nor is he eat meat all day. It's just like, eat food, not too much, mainly plants. I love that, because here's the second cardinal rule. You got to eat a rainbow of fruits and veggies every day. And you have to audit yourself. In fact, even get your kids to help you audit the fridge. So red, orange, yellow, green, blue, purple, there's a point to all of that variety. And by the way, purple happens to be one of the most important, loaded with proanthocyanidins and polyphenols, amazing for your brain and for your heart and for exercise recovery. But if you realize, I haven't had purple for a few days, well, you better get off to the grocery store and the produce aisle and get some purple grapes or some purple cabbage or some eggplant. I don't care what it is, just make sure you fill on that particular color of the rainbow. So that's second. And then ensure your diet's rich in protein and healthy fats. I mean, here's you've heard of this before. I know you have, and I know most of your audience has. There is such a thing as an essential fatty acid or essential fatty acids. There's such a thing as essential amino acids, which form protein. But think about this. There's no such thing as essential carbohydrates. Doesn't exist. Right. So, we all have to learn how to reduce on those micronutrient deficient, again, packaged, just filled with sugar and vegetable oils, and just, sock those away. It's what our brain craves. A lot of studies actually show very similar to the way it would crave heroin or crack cocaine. But we have to control those cravings, and we have to do our best to eat food, not too much, mainly plants.
Mm. What do you think? What would you suggest? I know a lot of the listeners are athletes. They've got triathlons, Ironmans. They're preparing for all sorts of things. I know you've done a fair few of these kind of events yourself. And what do you suggest when it comes to going out on those long bike days, long run days? Where we tend to feel like we need more carbohydrates, and we tend to need it probably a little bit better packaged than maybe the way nature has packaged all of these things. What are your recommendations on doing exercise with all this stuff?
Sure. Well, the technology is there, and it's available to test yourself at home. So if you are well into ketosis and you're following sort of a ketogenic style diet, well, then you don't need that. You don't need the sugar. You're already in that phase. If you're not and you're out of that, then yes, sir, I agree. I mean, there's been times, and again, that's high competition, as you're mentioning prior. Your relationship with that 79-year-old gentleman turning 80, maybe not being so strict with his diet. Well, guess what? He's almost 80 years old, and guess what? He doesn't have to be. And by the way, there's also something, and he's doing triathlons all the time and practicing. So yeah, no, he can afford to have that brownie once in a while, or that extra serving of white rice. He is, and I'm not about, calories in, calories out. That's absolutely in part what I was just describing. In fact, not all calories are equal. We are also not bomb calorie meters, and this is where the whole, calorie idea started from. You pack a bomb calorie meter with a piece of 1, gram of protein versus, a brownie that also has a gram of protein. It's not going to blow up in the same way. Just as a gram of spinach would be metabolized by the body in a different way and not yield the same nutrient values. So what I think is that there's an exception to the rule, but that's all it is. People should learn. In fact, this is the point. There's always going to be exception. So don't make the exception. So you'll be at a wedding, you'll be at a birthday party, and you will have that piece of cake. But to make the exception is to purchase this at the grocery store and stock it in the pantry in your kitchen. That's so. Don't make exceptions when there's already exceptions to be had. But at the same time, I am definitely not an extremist. These are general cardinal rules to follow. That if you do that by about 80%, you should be well off. I tell that my patients all the time. Give me 80% compliance because I know you'll quote unquote cheat. I don't just mean diet. I mean forgetting to take your supplements or not showing up to your intravenous appointments or whatever. But give me 80% compliance, and you'll see 100% results.
I think that's the way Laura and I have tried to live always, is that 80-20 kind of mindset, is do the best you can with the knowledge that you have. And I think we're all starting to get more and more educated. I think, over this last 20 years it's like you said, it's become less alternative and it's becoming more, okay, this is natural. Okay, there's more conversations about keto. There's more conversations about fat. We're getting educated. It just took a little while. We didn't have the knowledge. And, I did a podcast episode with Dave Scott. And Dave Scott for people that don't know, he's basically the godfather of triathlon and Ironman. He won 6 Kona Ironman World Championships in the 80s, and one of the greatest sort of athletes our sport's ever seen. And had him on, and he's a big advocate on, keto and everything you're talking about. And he basically said, look, I was preaching all the way through the 80s and 90s. You would hear me yelling that, you need to eat carbohydrates and get away from the fat.
Yeah, he rewrote his whole book.
And he's like, I was wrong. He's like, I was wrong, everybody. I'm telling you. And, he's now dealing with some of his own medical conditions and everything because of the effects of what he did to his body in his 20s and 30s that have affected him later on in life. And a part of what we're talking about here is not just to find energy and performance now. It's about, how do I want to be 10, 20, 30, 40 years from now? How do I do that now? What can I do to my body now that's going to best prepare me for my health span, my longevity? And that was what Dave was really preaching. And it was thoroughly enjoyable conversation, actually. If you ever want to listen to one, he was very educated and it was really great. So that's a great kind of place to start with nutrition. And I like the fact that you're not preaching either way, whether it's, veganism or whatever we're talking about. But, if you're going to eat fish, eat wild fish. If you're going to eat meats, try and do the grass-fed and finished meats and try and be organic. I love all that. And now for the rest of the time, like we said, 80-20, but we're probably still missing a fair bit out of our diets and our nutrition. And this is where supplements comes into the equation. And personally for myself, over the years, I've been on and off different supplements and everything else and trying to figure out what's the best thing for me. If I said to you, Bryce, look, what is something that everybody should just have in their pantry? Is there a list that you said, look, these are all A+ supplements. You got to have these no matter who you are?
Yeah, well, certainly in this current climate where the focus is immunity and where the science leads us to believe there are certain ingredients that we could definitely do well by to improve and enhance our immune systems. And I will purposely not use the term boost. We've gotten, again, semantics and nomenclature too used to using that word. It's technically incorrect, but certainly support or strengthen or create resilience within our immune system. I believe that, and you probably heard, the recent work of Dr. Rhonda Patrick around vitamin D. I love that research around vitamin C. I think there's, folks should probably not hyperdose with that, but 500 milligrams is really where the literature sits. But most of us, are deficient, whether we're north or south of 40 degrees, latitude, and simply don't get enough exposure to vitamin D. So vitamin D and vitamin C for sure. I think also that vitamin E is a big one, often misunderstood. And I don't mean tocopherols, but tocotrienols. There's 8 isomers of vitamin E, and this is the other 4 that have not been well promoted, but do all kinds of good for the immune system and energy pathways. I think N-acetylcysteine is something to follow, and I think quercetin is a big one to take a look at. It's a bioflavonoid, often found in high concentrations in onions and brightly colored orange and yellow fruits and vegetables. Quercetin is, something that, along with vitamin D, might actually help prevent adherence of certain viruses from entering the cell, which seems to be a big issue as to how this current one is working. So that's sort of a list now. But I mean, you can't get away with most of us can't get away without taking an omega-3 fatty acid. I am always one about clean sourcing. By the way, I should say a little bit of background on my. My knowledge of ingredients is not just sort of clinical and reviewing white papers. I literally travel the planet, boots on the ground in the manufacturers of the ingredients that supply the consumer-facing brands. So I've been everywhere. I've seen it all. And so initially, it's kind of, the white papers that might intrigue me. But then next thing you know, I'm off in the depths of the forests in Malaysia, the palm forest, looking at this extract of tocotrienols, or I'm in Japan studying, theanine. or I'm traipsing across Missouri egg cracking district, learning about natural eggshell membrane. I mean, I visited well over 25 different manufacturers and done deep dives all over the place, and then I do these documentaries on them. I've done my due diligence on the omega-3 industry, and I think a company that's doing it the best, a manufacturer, is DSM, well known for some time to be this, the biggest manufacturer of fish oil derivative omega-3. But I think one of the products that they're manufacturing, found in multiple finished products, consumer-facing brands, is a DHA 2-to-1 ratio of DHA to EPA from an algal source. And algae that's not scraped out of the bottom of the ocean and then pasteurized or something, but this is algae that has been refined and genetically picked, if you will, because it's got a high output of DHA and EPA, and they basically distill it like they would beer, a fully self-contained. So I'm all about sustainability. I'm all about safety, obviously, and efficacy, but traceability and transparency, like where these things are coming from, and the shortest, touch points, into the environment and or exposure. So this DHA EPA algal source, which by the way is so important to the brain as well as the immune system and the heart, and the purity and the potency of this stuff. So I would say everyone should be looking into that. Life's Omega. It's
called Life's Omega.
That's the source. Yeah. Like I typically, I typically speak like you do to ingredients versus brands. I'm not as much. There's often the case to be made where you have to talk about a brand simply because they control that ingredient. But aside from that, I'm a huge, just like I would say, probiotics are wonderful as well. We need to pay more close attention to our microbiome. And people hear about prebiotics, but a lot of folks don't really understand the importance of the prebiotic, especially as it relates to, by the way, postbiotics. Have you ever talked to anybody about postbiotics?
Postbiotics? Absolutely no.
So we know about prebiotics, and you, of course, know that by now we've got a microbiome. It's really important for endurance athletes, by the way, because we all know the feeling of long distance run or triathlon, and we get upset bowels. It's almost as if it's akin to antibiotic associated diarrhea. We've all been there. And by the way, I personally love eco challenges. I am not an elite athlete. I love endurance sports. I would call myself more of a non-professional enthusiast. Certainly a step up from a weekend warrior, but I've never thought of trying out at the elite level. I've done, the Coastal Challenge, as was one of my favorites. This was a rainforest run, 235 kilometers along the Pacific coast of Costa Rica that weaved in and out of the mountains, some insane elevations, I'll tell you, over the course of 6 days. It's basically a marathon every day, and the wheels came off on that one. But I will never forget how, it was day 5. And I did not want a DNF, and not to be too graphic, but all I had was some broad leaves and digging a hole in the ground to take pit stops and to satisfy what was ultimately a major acute dysbiosis. And so full circle back to probiotics, prebiotics, and the need to be taking these pre and post major events, I think is key. So once again, we've got this immune system in our gut. About 80% of our immunity resides in the gut. It's called GALT, or gut-associated lymphoid tissue. Obviously, it helps to keep bad bugs at bay and manages inflammation through cytokine discussions to the vagus nerve and the brain, et cetera. But generally, it keeps things going there, down in the gut smoothly, right? And when a probiotic is ingested supplementally, the bacteria actually first has to locate fiber-rich foods, ideally soluble fiber, because that's what they eat. They have to eat just like we have to eat. And where they eat, they have to discard waste. Most people don't think of that sort of in and out scenario. So what they leave behind are called postbiotics. However, this is not obviously the equivalent of some kind of probiotic poop. These are actually really healthy for you. They're necessary for you. So as I mentioned, they have to eat, and they have to eat a very high quality fiber. And unlike insoluble fiber that creates the roughage and bulk in the poop, this is soluble, and they're able to ingest that. And sort of like us, we probiotics have their favorite sort of junk foods, right? And then there's what's actually good for them. And that's the lots of fruits and veggies that contain, a lot of soluble fiber. And a lot of other fibers can act like junk food and actually cause dysregulation, like gas and bloating and distension. Whereas a higher quality, soluble fiber found in foods, and in fact, one that I love, which is an extract of the guar bean, is super healthy for your probiotics. And so what they ultimately leave behind once they've been fed well are certain classes of B vitamins, vitamin K. You've heard of short chain fatty acids and the sort of Goldilocks scenario around those guys. Got not too many, not too few. Glutathione. I'd love to get into that a little bit more with you as well. But they actually, some species manufacture glutathione down there. And then other things like antimicrobial peptides and phytoestrogens and fulvic acids. Basically, if you feed your microbiome the way you should be feeding yourself, you will, athlete or otherwise, feel a huge difference.
So I need you to probably run through a couple of very clear, like you mentioned, the guar bean. What other things would you say, look, put this on the top of your list for your microbiome?
Yeah, it's super simple. Google soluble versus insoluble fiber. And there are gazillions of lists. And you might want to, if you're the typical individual, again, elite athlete or otherwise, that often has, irritable bowel syndrome like symptoms, I'd highly encourage you, Monash University over there in your part of the world, they've come up with the best research around the FODMAP classification of food. So often there is, there's good food, right? But people are different. People are individual, and some can manage these fructooligosaccharides and polyols better than others. So there's lists that if you find like you're trying to increase your roughage, you're trying to increase your soluble fiber from natural sources like fruits and vegetables, which I highly endorse, you might find that you still have an upset stomach. So I'd at that point suggest that you avoid FODMAP foods, distinguished specifically by Monash University. So you look up Monash University FODMAP, follow that criteria, and you'll come to learn like, oh, wow, onions and garlic, all these years I've been told are so good, are actually the biggest culprit in my digestive health. They're causing upset stomach and distension and hyperpermeability. So it's something I've had good success with when I've asked people to increase their soluble fiber, but with the caveat in some cases that they have to avoid or limit the FODMAP classification of that fiber.
Perfect. I'll put all of that. That'll all be in the show notes, everybody. So in case you're scrambling, you're on a bike listening to this, don't worry. I'll put all of it in show notes and you can come back and it'll all be there for you. Now, you mentioned, so I've been taking the omega-3s, the D3. I take probiotics. I actually use a brand called, not that I'm pumping brands out, but I use a brand called Regular Girl. I just thought I'd mention it because it's called Regular Girl, but it's a company that Laura's worked with for a number of years. And yes, us guys can even take it as well. It has the probiotic, as you mentioned.
It's interesting as you talk about that. There you go. That's a brand, but us guys can take that as well. It turns out that is exactly the quality guar bean soluble fiber I'm talking about. It's a very regulating fiber, and it's the perfect prebiotic for the probiotics. I really think So here's a link you should post up on your site and show notes as well. I just happen to be quite proud that it's a Canadian link, but the work was done by a Canadian pharmacist. And it's a link to look at probiotics by indication. So here's the thing: there might be the right prebiotic, as we just described, right? Sun fiber, Regular Girl, guar bean extract. There's no such thing as the right or best probiotic. Guess why? It's just simply what has been evidence-based on the strain and species by indication that confers the health benefit. So is there the right strain and species by fingerprint to confer health benefit in the case of post-antibiotic associated diarrhea? Yes. Or irritable bowel syndrome? Yes. Or Crohn's and colitis? Yes. Or post, endurance athletic diarrhea? Yes. So there's all these indications. So probioticchart.ca is that list, the best, peer-reviewed, clinical evidence-based, for adult health, women's health, pediatric health. You take a peek at that, and then what you'll notice is brands have to be identified, because you have a company like Activia, Do you guys have that by you, that brand?
I've heard of that, actually.
Yeah.
Maybe just through advertising or something, but yes, I've heard of it.
Yeah, so you have that. So it's a brand. It's not the best probiotic, but it's got, B. animalis in it. Well, what the hell is that? That's a probiotic strain 2494 that happens to be, level evidence 1, so class 1, which is the best for constipation and irritable bowel. Great. But it's not indicated for antibiotic-associated diarrhea, nor is it indicated for oral health, nor is it indicated necessarily for Helicobacter pylori, H. pylori, nor is it indicated for traveler's diarrhea or immune enhancement. So there's no such thing as the best probiotic. It's simply the best probiotic on indication. But there's definitely reason to believe there is the best prebiotic.
Do you think we can get to the point where we could have something in our phone app where it does just take a fingerprint and it'll tell you what you need to be taking for probiotics?
Well, I've been for a long time in clinical practice using a really, really neat technology provided by Genova Diagnostics. In fact, I run a lot of tests, and I'm pretty sure you guys are familiar with one called the NutriVal. I think you and Laura.
Yeah, Laura and I have both been like that. Laura's been on NutriVal for a long, long time.
Yeah, so that's looking at blood and urine and checking your entire citric acid and Krebs cycle for energy production, and then downstream looking at neurotransmitters and neuropeptides and amino acid sequencing and vitamins and minerals that you might be lacking and all that stuff. But they also offer another test, and I love this lab. They're in North Carolina, in the trifecta of where all this research is going on in lab biochemistry and functional medicine. But these guys do something called the GI effects, and the GI effects is a stool test. And so using, a sample from somebody's stool, sending it to the lab, they're able to tell me what that individual is growing or not growing within a panel of 26 commensal bacteria that they should be growing, plus potentially pathogenic, as well as sometimes pathogenic bacteria that compete. It's kind of like real estate down there, right? You know the deal. I mean, if one bacteria, whether it's non-pathogenic or not, is taking up more real estate than another one, that's in and of itself dysbiosis or imbalanced, bacteria, good or bad or whatever the case may be. It's all about strains and species and how much real estate they're taking up. So it'll look at that, and then it'll look at if there is potentially pathogenic or pathogenic bacteria down there, what individual, both pharmacologic as well as natural ingredients, seem to be the best to kill off those good bacteria. So I don't know about a fingerprint, but I do know that a stool sample goes a long way.
Yeah.
And with that information, I've been able to rehabilitate individuals' guts. On this topic, I just got to say, I have zero, I believe there's zero credibility around doing food sensitivity panels until, and there's still even some caveat there, but until you've done an appropriate evaluation of your gut. Mm-hmm. And here's why. You have to understand whether or not you've got hyperpermeability. We're permeable down there. That's what the small intestine does to absorb macronutrients, right? But if we're hyperpermeable, then stuff, literally bacteria and long chain carbohydrate and protein sequences leak into the general circulation that shouldn't. Then your immune system gets confused and starts to create antibodies against that food. But if you don't correct the leakiness, essentially, this is the affectionate term given to hyperpermeability, leaky gut syndrome. You don't correct that, then you're ultimately, by doing a food sequence assessment for food sensitivities, you're going to come up with a ridiculous amount of false positives. Right? So there's no point that you're wasting your money. And it just kills me because I hear so many people just sort of going into, a naturopath's office like mine and then saying, can I get a food sensitivity test, getting it? And then they're like, oh my God, what do I even eat now? They're given 250 restrictions. So, a lot does reside in the gut. The immune system resides in the gut. We just briefly talked about it in context of prebiotics, but many people in North America, due to their poor diets, have leaky gut. And there's a great test to have done. It's actually provided by McGill University here in Canada, among others. The test is called a Zonulin Test. And I got to say, the research is very, very conclusive around this too. Once you have a leaky gut, you also have a leaky brain, because zonulin is kind of this gatekeeper of these cells that ultimately line up for the blood-brain barrier, as they do in the gut line up between the villi and your general circulation. So it's a really important one, I think, that people have on their radar if they've got general systemic issues, brain fog, their endurance is, succumbing to diet and or just not able to figure out what's going on. Look into leaky gut. Look into how the gut is playing a role.
It's fascinating. Just a quick mini break before we get back to the show. I just want to remind you guys to go check out athleticgreens.com/Greg. Sign up and get your free 20 daily travel packets with your first order of $79 added value. That's athleticgreens.com/Greg. I mean, we're talking about the nutrition side of things. Do you think overtraining in sport also affects the leaky gut? Yeah.
Well, absolutely. Well, no, overtraining is absolutely just as unnatural as a junk food diet.
Wow.
And the stressors on the body, they're just different types of stressors. I mean, I'm a full believer in finding the sweet spot, Goldilocks zone, and again, appreciating the individual's genetics. I mean, there are genes that literally dictate that you should not engage in intense aerobic activity. Superoxide dismutase, your ability to detoxify through the family of super genes known as glutathione S transferase, so GSTT1, GSTP1, GSTM1. If you have null variants of GSTT1, you're not producing glutathione. I'd love to get into that with you, by the way, because this is really a master antioxidant in the body. But
let's talk about that. Let's talk about glutathione right now, because I've been really keen, because I've just started taking a product called Continual G, and their product is glytine. But tell me about all of that and why I should be doing it.
Yeah, that's where the science exists. So just really quickly to frame this up, just to finish, that idea around overtraining. If you're overtraining without a therapeutic intervention, again, you're just eating healthy. That's great. Continue to do that. But now your stressors are higher than they are naturally. So you have to go beyond diet. You have to implement therapeutic intervention, and you can't do that other than taking these ingredients scientists have discovered that actually work. And that's what we're going to get into momentarily. Yeah. But it's all about hormesis. That's the Goldilocks zone. That's the sweet spot, right? Too little stressor, no good. Too much stressor, no good. But exercise is a hormetin. That's one for folks, if they haven't heard of that terminology before, to look up. Hormesis, HORMESIS. It's that perfect level of stress, that perfect dose of an ingredient that may actually be itself a stressor. But glutathione, this is just, it's going to take a little bit of time to unpack this, because this is just such some estimates actually show that endurance athletes, on top of, those that have an awareness and their radar is on supplementation, and they know how important this detox antioxidant is that in North America alone, we're spending about $500 million. That's annually on supplemental glutathione, which shockingly doesn't work. Does not work. So you mentioned glycine a moment ago. I'm going to tell you about that, and from what I know as well, because I've done the deep dive on that also. Supplementation with glutathione is incapable, the research supports this, of increasing intracellular glutathione. That's where glutathione works, right? As it relates to the ATP production downstream of the mitochondria, it works to protect the mitochondria and sweep up oxidative stress. So since the glutathione concentration found in the extracellular environment after supplementation or your own body producing it, because by the way, you'll be happy to learn, you produce it. We have to live. But that extracellular environment is much lower than that which is found intracellularly by about 1,000-fold. Okay. So this large difference actually means that there is a very high, actually it's probably even an insurmountable concentration gradient that prohibits extracellular glutathione from entering cells. It's that supersaturation concept, right? But enter on scene, this glycine, as you're talking about, and actually it's a distillation kind of made to be easier to sort of remember, of gamma-glutamylcysteine. So this is a molecule, glycine they've affectionately called it. This is a molecule that seems to be the solution to the absorption, because it fuels the pathway intermediate of glutathione transportation. So actually, maybe we should even take a step back here and discuss the importance of glutathione at large, because this is known as an anti-inflammatory, redox. So this is sweeping up the mess of day-to-day life. But when you're an elite athlete, boy, oh boy, do you need more of it. So many know it for detoxification, but so few people realize how an incredible amount of research and information has emerged in the scientific literature on this being a crucial player in regulating inflammation. By the way, immunity as well. So inflammation, sport recovery, immunity hasn't been known for that, just as powerful to do that as in effect, detoxification. Probably the most effective antioxidant at destroying those reactive oxygen species you've heard about, or free radicals. I wrote my whole first book on this called The Antioxidant Prescription. And These are produced purposely by our immune system in response to threats. It's kind of like the bullets in your proverbial gun, and it protects us as well from the destructive effects of all this oxidative stress. So we need a certain amount again. It's that Goldilocks level. So here's what's going on. So the core mediators of the immune system, the lymphocytes, and those turn into various natural killer cells. You've heard of those. It's so important at this juncture, this current time, as it relates to pandemic and even the upcoming cold and flu season. Lymphocytes perform, their bacterial and their viral and their anti-cancer cell killing abilities by generating huge amounts of these reactive oxygen species. That's what they do. But they're bad, right? After a certain amount, they're necessary. But again, it's this Goldilocks formula. So too much is no good, too little is no good, because these species are so highly toxic, and not only to bacteria, but also to our own bodies, to our own tissue. Glutathione efficiently then neutralizes an overproduction of reactive oxygen species. That's the gold nugget right there of information. So the pace of free radical generation, which is obviously due to high levels of endurance activity that we talk about, and as one example, can often surpass the cellular production of glutathione. So if your exercises surpass that, this leads to a whole cascade of oxidative stress and chronic inflammation and tissue damage. So it turns out, actually, the literature is very supportive that even a temporary drop in a single day in optimal glutathione levels may actually cause harm due to this oxidative stress. So besides activity, by the way, being in excess, just simply aging, advancing age, and poor lifestyle choices we talked about early on, environmental stressors, and even those genes I talked to you about, the whole superfamily of glutathione genes, the susceptibility of all those things play a role in taxing glutathione levels. But again, optimal level of glutathione is very easily compromised, and it's an important objective for any cell in your body, brain cell, liver cell, blood cell, any cell, to maintain glutathione at optimal levels at all times, right? And as efficient our cells are in doing that, our glutathione levels often drop below this optimal level, because as we age and with chronic health issues, and this, and most athletes know this idea, homeostasis becomes out of whack. So as homeostatic levels decrease, and this is where our requirements remain the same, but the cell stops producing it in the quantities that it's needed because homeostasis ultimately has been reached, right? I use this analogy with my patients often, and it's a fundamental homeostatic level, and that is temperature. It's very tightly controlled, right? So 98.6 degrees Fahrenheit or 36.8 degrees Celsius, pretty constant throughout our lives. Actually, that's interesting. I've been reading some research around the thyroid and how this is changing due to exogenous stressors and so forth. Actually, we're just generally getting cooler. I'm not sure if you heard that or not, but generally as a population, this temperature consistence actually dropping a few decimals. Anyway, I digress. So the normal level of glutathione, which is set by our cells, does change. So it changes, it decreases with age and chronic disease, even though we need the same amount of this, going back to that earlier point, we need the same amount of glutathione throughout our lives. It decreases as we age. This, if you use that temperature analogy, imagine, our body temperature slowly dropping over time to levels ultimately which wouldn't be sustainable to, life. So we have to maintain glutathione levels above this decreasing homeostatic level. That's my bottom line. And to date, ultimately, progress in achieving this has been really, really slow. We've heard of things like N-acetylcysteine or selenium or alpha-lipoic acid as being precursors, but the science has debunked that. This doesn't really work. And especially glutathione itself does not increase cellular glutathione. And so, by the way, we talked about the NutriVal. This is by Genova Diagnostics, and you and Laura are familiar with the NutriVal. One of the most important markers among a lot of others that I keep my eye on is the whole blood glutathione, ultimately, which is an indirect measure since, once again, it's the intracellular glutathione that even matters more. So bottom line, with this recent commercial availability of the gamma glutamylcysteine, or the glycine, which is GGC, the immediate precursor to glutathione, this will achieve cellular glutathione above homeostasis. So now that's possible. And by the way, anyone who wants to look up, this research, one of the best trials done by Martin Zarka, actually, and his team at the Faculty of Science at UNSW in Sydney,
Mhm.
at the School of Biotechnology and Biomolecular Sciences. He published in Redox a few years ago showing that even a single dose measurably increased lymphocyte levels, that's intracellularly, within 90 minutes. So the research is percolating up, and we're now seeing it. In a clinical sense, I would be injecting a patient if I found that they had GST deficit, they were null variant. I would be injecting them with glutathione, and often with some success, but not as much as I would expect. With this stuff, this glycine, now I'm seeing a lot better result. And the cost and the invasiveness of intravenous injections, and of course, let alone how somebody has to literally make their way into my office and spend half a day getting these injections. So yeah, I'm moving my practice over to this oral glycine, and away from intravenous injections.
Can you over supplement with it? Or is it you talk about homeostasis? Is it what happens if you take it? Like at the moment, I'm taking it every day. I'm like, I've been on it for a month or so, and I'm very curious. What do you think about that?
Well, especially for you. So take everyone in context, especially for you as an elite athlete. I don't think you could. I think people would be possibly wasting their money by taking more than they needed. But that's my point in trying to achieve beyond homeostasis. See, homeostasis is all about the cellular mechanics, sort of understanding, but being duped by age. So over time, we produce less and less, just as we produce less and less ATP. But I mean, we can get into this is just a whole other can of worms. But the whole point is that over time, as we age, we stop producing these things, including hormones, as much as we otherwise would. So to come outside of the cell over homeostasis for glycine is only going to invite more glycine through the cell. Once it's in the cell, now it's going to make glutathione. It's not going to make more glutathione than it needs to within the cell as to do what it needs to do optimally. Gotcha. It's not going to. So you're not going to dampen your immune system because, again, this day and age where you're either an endurance athlete, following everything you should, and the stressors coming from the exercise, or the opposite, you're a couch potato eating a poor diet, and the stressors coming from inactivity and poor nutrient. So the majority of us need to supplement with this stuff, and the majority of us need to enhance our glutathione pathways.
Mate, that's fantastic. All of that we've just touched on a lot, and like I said, I'll put it all in show notes for everybody. But at the moment, for myself, it's I'm in South Florida, so I do supplement a little bit with vitamin D3, but I don't really feel like I need it. I'm in the sun a fair bit, but my omega-3, probiotics, prebiotics, the glycine, the glutathione, and the multivitamin, which through Nutraval we've been taking. I want to move on just to another area that I'm fascinated by, and I apologize to listeners if I always bring this up, but I'm a big believer in visualizing and the effects that we can have on our brain chemistry through the hormone effects, and that affects us, our physiology. This is an area that you've also got a fairly strong background in. I'd love to just touch on that and just how can we optimize our brain clarity, our attention, our learning, but also affect ourselves, physiologically? What have you got sort of suggestions for that?
Sure. So one of the gene subsets that I look at in a clinical practice is executive function. And that's essentially mood and behavior. So genes, those that control serotonin, dopamine, adrenaline, noradrenaline, BDNF. I'm a huge fan of this particular gene and the output, this neurotrophin, this protein in the brain called brain-derived neurotrophic factor. If we did anything for our brain health, it would be to focus on up-regulating BDNF, which, by the way, you'll be happy to really to learn, as you probably already know, by the way, that this is accentuated tremendously through exercise. So brain-derived neurotrophic factor, one thing that we've come to realize, neuroscientists in the last few decades, is that neuroplasticity, and that is the ability for the brain to change, as well as the development of new neural cells, neurogenesis, doesn't stop in your early teens. This goes on for the rest of your life, but to some degree or another. And you can accentuate this by upregulating brain-derived neurotrophic factor. That's done in a number of ways. I just mentioned exercise, but not just sort of a stroll in the park. I mean, actually pushing yourself, right? Vitamin D, we talked about that as well. It's very vitamin D dependent gene. You'll find people with vitamin D genetics that suggest that their vitamin D absorption and transportation is low and BDNF is low production, they're sun worshippers, because that's one way to get vitamin D or BDNF up. But we've learned about ingredients like whole coffee fruit powder. I mentioned quercetin early on in the show. Quercetin is another ingredient that can boost and upregulate BDNF, because this will, ultimately improve mood and behavior, improve sleep, lower anxiety. So I look at all these genes because they can help us understand how to support either up or down regulate these various hormones or proteins to optimize focus, attention, alertness, concentration, and above all, perhaps even sleep. A lot of folks are having problem with sleep. And so I do that using nutrition and supplementation, but I couldn't be happier to discuss the importance of mindfulness and the importance of visualization. By the way, just before I do, one of my favorite supplements on this topic is theanine, but not from green tea. Yes, you can take that. Yes, you can use that, but actually it's prohibitively expensive to extract from green tea. So the best source is actually by a proprietary fermentation process, which has been perfected by the Japanese. It's called sun theanine. And this has been shown to do all of this, to improve focus, attention, alertness, concentration. 5 really well done studies in children with ADHD that also improve their sleep along with focus and alertness. But even in adults, well over 90 clinical trials have been done on this particular ingredient. So I love this ingredient. It's an amino acid. You can't go wrong.
When would you take that? Before bed or
twice a day? In the morning time, about 200 milligrams in the morning, 200 in the evening. The morning dose is going to increase that sharp focus and that alertness, that concentration. The evening dose actually going to upregulate delta. So you're going to actually have a lot easier time getting into the appropriate sleep architecture. So, and to get to your question, really, I love combining a mindfulness meditation at night with my PEMF technology. So this is pulsed electromagnetic frequency. Not going to get into that right now, but folks can look that up. PEMF is just increased circulation to the brain and the muscles, microvessel circulation, which is different than you'd realize, primary circulation. This is a micro level. It increases that, which also improve recovery time and just general blood flow. So, but whilst I also go over what I refer to as a 24-hour edit, and this is lending from Ericksonian psychology and kind of combining it with neuro-linguistic programming, where you recreate and essentially visualize that recreation of your day ahead, just your 24 hours, not next week, not next month. You leave all that out. This is a 3-column on a piece of paper. The first column, and you write all these points out. You literally have to write it out. You can text it, whatever. You literally have to put pen to paper or thumb to keypad. You are writing out your expectations of the next 24 hours, right? Wow. I don't care what they are, and you assign emotions with each expectation. So I don't think I'm going to do as well in the race tomorrow because I haven't trained hard enough and my diet hasn't been as optimal as I hoped it was going to be. That's your expectation. If you hadn't visited that and been real and true with yourself, it wouldn't have been a point. But now it's a point because it's truly your expectation. You're being real with yourself. So that goes down. The emotion assigned with that is worry, guilt, anxiety. Okay. You do about 10 of these expectations. The second column is the edit. This is the most, it's actually not the most important column, but it's a very good column. The edit. And the edits, you're like an editor of a movie, right? Where, or even the director and editor, you have full control. It's in the shot's been done, but there was that extra who came out at the wrong time. You want to edit that. So you literally take that situation, that expectation, and you take the emotions assigned and you recreate them. Because that's what this is lending from, the works of psychology around the self-fulfilling prophecy concept. And again, Ericksonian psychology and the whole neurolinguistics, because you're governing an area in your brain, which is in charge of the Wernicke's area and Broca's area of language. So you're speaking to yourself and recreating self-talk. So anyways, the second column are your edits. So
go give the example of that, of the example that you had with
the edit, right?
Yeah.
So the edit is then all of a sudden remembering how many times you did train, how many excellent meals you did have, and you didn't really have as many cheats as you're expecting too much of yourself probably. And let's be honest. And then so that expectation is, I stand a really great chance. Let's be realistic. I'm aiming for the, top 3, and screw the guilt. I am confident in myself. I'm proud of myself. Now you take that new edit, the new movie, and you play that over and over. right, in your mind. And that's the practice. That's the 10 minutes before bed. It doesn't take longer than this. And then you just leave it. And here, do you want to hear, this is now the most important column is the third column, but you don't complete that until the next night. So that's 24 hours later. And guess what? Of those 10 things you had as preconceived notions that then you created an edit around and played over and over in your head and you parked it, I'll promise you 6, maybe 7 or more times out of 10, out of those 10, you will have experienced the outcome as the edit. That's what you have to do. Now you're doing a checklist. So you've done the expectation, the edit, and now you do the list of outcomes. What actually transpired, the way you expected initially or the way you edited it? And I'm telling you, 60 to 70% of the time, it's the way, not every time, obviously that's unrealistic, but so many more times than not, the outcome column has transpired as you edited your experience. And it's just 24 hours ahead. And this is, again, it's lending on, biochemistry and psychology. I mean, the more you do that, the proof in the concept of this, that is to say, the more you prove that your outcomes reflect your edit, the more you realize that this works, the more you realize you have control over your 24-hour destiny. I don't love models that suggest that we have full control over, what happens to us 2 or 3 years from now, because that's not really congruent with, day to day. But certainly we have control over.
I love that.
24 hours ahead.
I've been practicing especially with this, the COVID and the lockdown and everything else. And I think sometimes you can feel your blood pressure getting up with, sometimes you feel like the world's being silly or whatever it is, and you're like, whoa, calm down. And for me, that's been just practicing, replacing that with gratitude.
Absolutely.
And that's been a really powerful. So what I do now with the whole washing the hand thing is, okay, I go do my workout or whatever, and I go and I wash my hands, and it takes 30 to 40 seconds. And I'm washing my hands, and first thing I do is I go, okay, what am I grateful for? And my health, my strength, my fitness, blah, blah, blah. Then my wife, the kids, and everything we got around it. And it's amazing how if I quickly grab when I'm working out in the gym, quite often, they've got the news blaring, and I don't watch media much at all, actually, ever. But it is when I'm working out. And so I often feel like my blood pressure starts to go up, and I can just feel this angst and, whatever it is. But then I go and I wash my hands, and it's amazing if I just practice that gratitude, take ownership of what's happening and replace it with something else. I mean, it's much the same as the edit as what you're talking about.
Well, do you mind if I actually borrow that for a moment and use that as an example? So in the practice that I'm referring to, as I'm alluding to the 24-hour edit. So in your 10 minutes the night before, you might say to yourself, most of my anxiety comes from, when I wash my hands and realize, this whole COVID pandemic is still something we're challenged with, and I got to wear a mask before I go into every store, public place, and it just makes you anxious. So that's your current preconceived notion, is that you will feel anxious and blood pressure will go up when you wash your hands or put on your mask. So that's your preconceived notion. So what's going to happen if you otherwise didn't do an edit? Exactly that. So that's a perfect example. Let's use that as an opportunity to implement the gratefulness practice. So tomorrow, instead of feeling anxious, I know that at 10:30 I have a meeting in X public place that I otherwise would have to put my mask on, feel anxious about, and clean my hands for. No, as soon as I put that mask on and go to wash my hands, I am going to go through the list of what I'm grateful for. Mm-hmm. Play that 5 or 10 times over in your head. What's going to happen the next day when you go to wash your hands? Mm-hmm. You're going to actually start to ramble down the list of what you're grateful for.
Mm. Yeah, and it has been amazing how that just, you start taking ownership of it a lot quicker. And I think that's part of it. I think what we're talking about is that ability to just take ownership of what's going on in your life, some of the anxiety and the expectations we all place on ourselves. And nobody's harder on you than you. I'm actually quite experienced at letting go of everybody else's expectations and just focusing on mine and how I can manage that. And as athletes, I think we all become quite in tune with that. I think if you want to perform on the world stage, you tend to become quite in tune with managing your own expectations. But for me, it was also, I mean, you mentioned you like to look at 24-hour kind of. For me, it was always, I did visualize events often months in advance, whether I was, on the massage table or
sure.
I was doing a physical visualizing, which I call when I was out, doing a workout, and I'd have the commentator in my head, and, I'd have all the athletes around me, and it was the event and everything else. The brain chemistry, if we repeat those things enough, we can affect ourselves hormonally, which then affects our physiology. Would you agree?
100% agree.
Mm.
We are, we are masters of our own destinies. As you described, athletes have a much better command, over the longer term goals. And like you said, they've worked their way up. I suppose a large part of my, followers and listeners would be those of the average Joe, where I can't, those are extreme ethereal concepts for them to imagine if they haven't otherwise experienced the world of athleticism and set longer term goals, which is why I refer to 24 hours ahead. But no, for sure, brain chemistry, even our DNA, we're not talking about editing DNA like CRISPR, but when we do this self-reflection, self-talk, expectations, recreating expectations, you can't change your DNA, but you can definitely manage genetic expression using the power of thought, obviously the things we've talked about, nutritional and supplemental influence, to modify that executive function, genetic expression, like I described. I mean, you can, this is actually something the Japanese refer to as Shinrin Yoku, which is forest bathing. You can take a walk in the forest, which is just amped up in these negative ions, which is maybe counterintuitively good for you. They're positive for your health, but these negative ions boost serotonin. You can go for a walk in the forest and boost your serotonin and self-talk yourself probably to a higher serotonergic output than an antidepressant.
Wow.
That's what science is showing. By the way, it's a great little exercise too for those who are experiencing anxiety in the moment. It's free and it's incredibly effective. And some studies show even more than the benzodiazepines, which is the classification of anti-anxiety drugs, is just to take a deep breath through your nose for a count of 4. And you hold, this is diaphragmatic breathing. You're very familiar with this, but you hold for a count of 7. For some folks who haven't done this before, it's a little uncomfortable. And then out through pursed lips for a count of 8. And you repeat that for about 60 seconds to about a minute and a half. So 4 to 5 cycles. But in through the nose for a count of 4, hold for a count of 7, out through pursed lips for a count of 8. I promise you are grounded in the moment, regardless as to your thoughts, regardless as to, your self-talk. You do that for a few minutes, whether you're experiencing road rage or, anxiety prior to a race, you will ground yourself.
I like that. 4, 7, 8.
Yep.
What about this is in terms of grounding and maybe explain grounding, because when I said to somebody, I think standing in the ocean, going for a swim in the ocean is one of the best grounding you can do. They said, well, what do you mean? I was like,
sure.
I was kind of stumped. So what is it when we say grounding?
I think I would define it as moving from a certain degree within the spectrum of fight or flight. So survivalistic thought process and physiology to parasympathetic mode. And that is using, everything from the earth's energies to self-talk to, proper nutrients. And again, the ocean is a perfect example of a very highly immersed negative ion environment as well. So grounding oneself is moving out of that typical state of survivalistic, you're adrenalized and cortisol is dominant, to a parasympathetic state. One way to actually observe this from a biophysiological perspective is to look at the work of Dr. Roland McCready and group at HeartMath Institute. You familiar with them?
No, I'm not. No.
Yeah, wonderful stuff. Technology that basically looks at heart rate variability. And what's interesting is this relates to even that breath that I described. The heart sends more thoughts to the brain and more connections go from the heart to the brain than even from the brain to the heart. Think about that for a second. Why was the physiology set up that way? Because dependent on how the heart beats, and this is almost kind of like intuition, why I feel gut feeling or my heart's pounding. I don't know why I'm stressed, but within nanoseconds prior to, a stressful or a fearful situation, you're kind of already sweating, heart beating and thinking what's going on, and then you react. So these guys have studied heart rate variability in context of stress. And originally the studies were done in the military, actually, to improve signals that go from the heart to the brain to be able to, to relax in the moment, at the front lines of engagement. So heart rate variability, if you think about the heart rate, we often think about pulse rate, 60 beats per minute, or as an athlete, 40, right? So that's beats per minute, but the heart doesn't beat exactly the same interval, second to second. Mm-mm. It's not 1 second per beat for 60 seconds, therefore 60 beats per minute. what it is, maybe it takes it 1.2 seconds to make a beat, and then maybe the next beat takes zero point 0.8 and the next beat takes 0.92. That variability, perhaps even counterintuitive, that variability, the higher that is, the more variability there is, the more at ease your brain is, the more you are in parasympathetic state, which is you relaxed, able to think, able to manage. Once you're in sympathetic state, rather, fight or flight, most of your brain regions shut down and blood goes to, the organs and muscles to get you the hell away from that danger. And that's where we sit in North America most of the time, because what we consider as, anxiety inducing, and certainly as pandemics doing this to us, is more often, Zoom meetings and calls and deadlines. And we've heard this before, right? This is that engagement of fight or flight that's chronic, and cortisol levels go up and our immune systems get depressed. But if you can create heart rate variability increase, and this is the beautiful thing about that breath and some other techniques, is you can literally engage your heart into a rhythmicity that tells your brain everything's going to be okay. So think about it for a second. When you take a deep breath, really deep breath, and that's as I was telling you, through that breath in for 4, and then you hold it for 7, what is happening physiologically to the heart? The heart has less space to beat, right? So for the moment you're holding your breath, it's going lub dub, lub dub, lub dub, lub dub, lub dub. Anyone can do it on their own right now, and most athletes would actually realize this intuitively. Then as soon as you let that breath out after 7 for a count of 8, the heart now all of a sudden has a lot more space to breathe because the lungs are not taking up the thoracic cavity, right? So now all of a sudden it goes from lub dub, lub dub, lub dub to lub dub, lub dub, lub dub, and then again lub dub, lub dub, lub, once you breathe in. What happens when you're in fight or flight? When you're in fight or flight, or you're nervous, you're stressed, you have a pant-like breath, right? So you're more often going like that. You're running, or you're in that fear sympathetic state. So what does your heart do in consequence? Sounds like this. Lub dub, 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 lub dub. No variability. And no variability is a signal to your brain that something is kind of wrong. And so you can enter an increased variability by simply engaging in that 4, 7, 8 breath. And that tells the brain everything is going to be all right. That's what I meant by literally within a minute or two, you can put yourself from sympathetic to parasympathetic state anywhere for free.
I love that. I've got a question then on that, because what about when it comes to sleep? So for me personally these days, I tend to go to sleep very well. First 3 to 4 hours, I sleep well. I take magnesium glycinate before bed, which, you can tell me more about that, but it's meant to help relax me. But then I do tend to wake up at sort of that 1 a.m. and I'm kind of awake. I can get back to sleep sometimes, but would be doing this kind of this breathing technique. Is that what's going on with the brain there, or is that a cortisol level problem? I mean, you probably
it could be a number of things. Yeah, we'd want to check out a number of things, number of various sleep wake hormones. The melatonin, serotonin. For some folks, I see taking a little bit extra B6 and B12 in combination with your magnesium. By the way, I like to combine magnesium glycinate or bisglycinate, as you described, with magnesium threonate, because if it's the peripheral nervous system and musculoskeletal system that we're talking about, then yes, the glycinate is excellent, but it doesn't bypass the blood-brain barrier. So threonate, magnesium threonate does. That could help. And then in combination of the B12 and B6, it could. So some people do a lot better by an evening dose of tryptophan, slow release. Other people do a lot better with an evening dose of 5-hydroxytryptophan. And yet other people, and this is all dependent on genes, do better yet with an evening dose of time-released melatonin. But either way, no matter what kind of person you might be, one of those 3 things, along with B6, B12, and magnesium threonate, it could help significantly. Yeah. And then in your expectations for the next day or even that night, if you say to yourself, it's happened 10 nights in a row. This is the craziest thing about human psychology. Think about this for just a second. Again, back to this whole sort of, projection analysis and, editing. If you flip a coin, this is now statistical inference, 1,000 times. If you flip a coin 1,000 times, and I know it's statistically not likely, but it still can happen. If it lands on tails every single time, what are the chances that the next flip is going to be heads?
Still 50-50, isn't it?
Every single time. Exactly. And anyone with any logic or intelligence is going to say that. And yet, think about this. we say to ourselves, geez, the last 3 nights out of
Mm.
like how many thousands of nights have you slept? I've gotten up at 1 a.m. and I've had a hard time getting back to sleep. You literally have set a pretty powerful expectation,
Yeah, I have.
right?
Yeah.
So what you need to do is, and then just the same way that you have a plan for hand washing and being appreciative, have a plan for when you get up versus not having a plan. Because not having a plan allows that next minute to evolve, which allows that heightened state of alertness, which allows the anxiety to say, I'm not going to fall. It's a vicious cycle. And we've all had it. But here's the plan. And this one's very effective. So you asked, and I'm answering yes. That part of the plan is that breathing technique. And that breathing technique, and this is a one-up, it's the divine equivalent of counting sheep. With breathing technique in place, so once you've gauged and you're now in that 4, 7, 8 rhythm, all of a sudden you start counting backwards from a really high number. I don't care what it is, it could be 1,000, but science shows by increments of 7. Why? Because we don't do that. It's the least common arithmetic that we do. So subtraction by increments of 7 from a high number, and at that same breathing technique, which is putting you very steadily and slowly into parasympathetic state, you're back off to sleep. But having the plan is key. So if you wake up and you go, I wonder what I should do, turn on your phone, best ways to get back to like, then you're already up. But if your plan is the second that you wake up and realize, oh, this is not the time that I was hoping to be up, deep breathing, 4, 7, 8. Okay, now I'm in that rhythm, counting backwards from it is ultimately, basically, in in psychology, so bloody boring that you're putting your
exactly. And I think it doesn't allow your mind to wander until it's asleep. Do you know what I mean? It's like it focus you. I like that. And you've touched on a little bit, and I appreciate all of this. I feel like you're giving me a free clinician, so I appreciate it. But you've touched on a few times throughout this chat about genetics and DNA, and it's interesting that you've mentioned that, because just recently Laura has done some tests, and I have just sent mine in, and I plan to have a doctor by the name of Dr. Mansour in to read me on a. He's a friend of yours, is he? He's going to come in and read mine on an episode coming up, and I'm really excited about that, because I think, like you said, I've talked a lot about on this show that I think the future of coaching and all sorts of things is we need to understand genetics and DNA more. So I've been very excited about this.
I'm envious. He's done mine. He's, I would call him part of the top 5 clinical genomists in the world. UCLA, Baylor, dual PhD graduate. The guy is a genius as it pertains to. We actually work together on some IP. He might get into that that we put into the world of nutrigenomics that we call nutrients. So he was the brains behind the genetics, and then I was the brains behind the assigning of ingredients to those genetic outcomes, and then ultimately that creates your nutrients, which is a play off on the word of, your nutrients. Yeah, nutrients, which are ingredients matched to your DNA. So that'll be an interesting conversation. Yeah. So it in fact is his IP that I use in a clinical setting to deduce hormone pathways and detox pathways and the various degrees of metabolism and how your body responds to diet and nutrition and brain mood and behavior dysfunction. So in my latest book, Brain Spanners, I actually have a whole chapter where I interviewed him on this topic. So brilliant. Yeah, I'm going to listen in on that one for sure.
Oh yeah, no, I'm excited about it. Now you've made me even more excited. But it's funny because I did get my results. But honestly, I think it's one thing to get these kind of results, but you need somebody to actually read them for you. And so to have him on the episode is just going to be absolutely fantastic. And that's, by the way, for people wondering, well, who we're using, it's called the DNA Company. You can look them up. The DNAcompany.com is Laura did hers a couple of months ago, and I thought, wouldn't it be fun to do mine and actually see how accurate was I doing the right thing by being a professional triathlete all my life? Or, I don't know. I just thought it'd be an interesting way to dissect my DNA and we can kind of hear what that's like. But yeah, I'm excited about that. Now, I know I've taken a lot of your time, but I've just got a couple of other quick things I'd love to chat to you about because, again, you're just a wealth of knowledge. Environmental toxins. Laura and I have really started to try and do better, especially since we have kids. We have a 2.5-year-old and a 6-month-old now. And so we're trying to do better with whether that's chemicals in the kitchen or what we're using for shaving creams and soaps and toothpaste. So, and then we've even got for Laura's birthday this year, I got a little EMF reader. When we're looking after our house and our health with these environmental toxins, are there certain things you would say to a client that you got to do immediately above all else?
Above all else is, it's one of those things where I would say, we could populate a laundry list of, key items to do, but I think first thing is not to be hyperzealous. I think that's,
all our listeners are type A athletes.
Yeah,
I don't think there's any of them.
they could do well with, calming down sometimes, because that's the very point. I mean, that's one of the biggest impetuses to remain engaged in fight or flight. So it's not to be passive either about these important things to consider. But it's Dr. Magda Havis is she's a PhD and a doctoral candidate, a doctor PhD out of Women's College Hospital here in Toronto within the University Health Network. I like to follow her and the work of Dr. Deborah Davis, along the lines of EMF. I'll tell you where we've gone, and this sounds extremist, but it also paints the picture and the logic for which we took action. So back about 10 years ago, my wife was starting to display these unusual symptoms of headache, acute onset, and also biliary sort of colic, and just sort of strange and also quite acute response. But it seemed that we'd worked it out, that it only ever happened when she was in the kitchen. And I thought that was initially an excuse for her to get out of the kitchen and not cook. As much as I love to cook, I thought, what is she up to here? But it didn't happen in other areas of the house. Turns out that so her good friend's sister's husband worked in the military in bomb detection, and he had this, $50,000 EMF detector, because that's how you set off bombs in the field. Apparently, is using Wi-Fi. Wow. And we asked, because of a deducement I won't even get into, but we asked if he would come over and just check out our house, because I'm not going to use a dowsing rod or some nonsense to do this. I want, real, actual, proven technology. So he comes over, and he looks all over the house, and we end up in the living room. We didn't give him any semblance as to why we're doing this or where we thought maybe there'd be some increased signals. Lo and behold, he had this. We back onto a pond, which backs onto a golf course, and he had this device aimed outside in that direction, and all of a sudden it went bonkers, just went berserk. It was like, he said, "What the heck is this?" We got in the car, went onto the golf course. Turns out that one of our major telecom companies had rented some land off the golf course. Long story short, put in a relay or something of an amplifier. And since we don't have any homes that back out into the back of our property, this was just relaying directly through our home to the rest of the neighborhood. Wow. So long story short, I repainted my entire house, took the whole family out for a couple of weeks on vacation, had the home repainted with this EMF blocking titanium solution with nickel cadmium in its black paint. And then, of course, painted over that with some appealing finish coat. But that blocked the EMF, of course, with the appropriate furnishings and the window coverings. And lo and behold, if she watches her exposure. So here's my point. I'm not electromagnetic sensitive. My wife is.
Is that right? Yeah. So is that in our DNA, or is that just chemical makeup?
Yeah, that's, I haven't, so again, this is the, some of the work of Dr. Deborah Davis, looking at individuals, she'll literally, multiple N of one over time, put them into, this experimental environment, leave the environment. They don't know, but she'll flip the switch on and off for standard, 2.5 or 3G up to 5G and expose them. And she has biophysiologic feedback, and it's blinded. Again, N of one over time, but she's coming up with some really interesting results. And so I think everyone's individual. Some people, I call this the human health threshold, where I think there's multiple things that are going on in any given individual. Once you've reached that threshold, and we're supposed to be able to manage stress, and we're supposed to be able to manage ethereal toxins in our environment. Like, we're still dealing with remnants of DDT in the 70s, still prolific, throughout our food chain, dioxins and furans and heavy metals in our waterway. I mean, look, and by the way, another reason to take that glycine, right? The continual G that helps detox, all of these things. But once we've reached our threshold, that is the ability to manage all things, toxic, all things, metabolic and even physiologic and psychologic. If we're at our human health threshold, some people have a boiling point of 100 degrees Celsius, and other people have a boiling point of 83 degrees. Who knows? But you figure that out. Any additional thing that pushes you over your personal threshold, you're going to become symptomatic. That's it, bottom line. So now as a clinician, my job is to decide and help you kind of as a medical sleuth investigator, what are those contributing factors that contribute at the highest percentage? For some folks, turns out that EMF is that contributing factor. For others, it's, viral, or for yet others, it's hormonal. But if we can figure that out and get you, if your threshold's 110, and we kind of figure that out, so better than average. And yet, Epstein-Barr virus that you got when you were 12 accounts for 70% of that. Well, if we remove that viral load and that reactivation of the virus, you're only dealing with a 30, 40%, a state that, you've got a buffer zone, right? That's what I'm getting at, that buffer. And so you're healthy. And that comes back to endurance athletes. I mean, some, this is too much stress for their bodies to handle, but they've come to realize how to take their bodies out of stress and do what they need to do. Others are still seeking yet other things like glycine, continual G, to help them to remain under threshold. Because once they're at threshold, then I'll tell you, whatever they're genetically susceptible to is often going to peak its ugly head.
That's fantastic. You know what's interesting about all of that is when you're talking about the EMFs and things is my wife, Laura, who we've mentioned many times, but she seems like she is affected. She gets the headaches and all sorts of things. And so that was the one reason with a lot of these things, they're kind of led by my wife, a bit like it sounds like you were with yours, in terms of she'll say, I've got these headaches or I've got this and this. And so we've become more aware of what the EMFs are around the house. And actually, the only thing that really blew off the scale was if you turned on the microwave in the kitchen. People do not stand near a microwave when it's running.
Sure.
Like that was the
especially
one that
especially older ones. Yeah.
Wow.
Anything that's 5 years or older, it's leaking for sure.
It was amazing. So that was the only one that really took our thing. And then we put we got rid of the smart meter and did a couple of the basic things that they
you don't want to sleep next to your phone that's on. You want an airplane mode. You definitely don't want your router. And, people should be turning it off anyways, no matter where it is in the house. You don't
we
want
turn our Wi-Fi off every night now.
Yeah.
And it's funny, a lot of this stuff, when Laura started doing it, I'm like, stop being such a hippie. It's like, and then all of a sudden you start doing a bit more reading and you're like, actually, it's not that hard to do, one. And two, actually, I think she's onto something, So it's
look, we're bioelectric beings, aren't we? Right? I mean, we're not just a sack of chemical. We're bioelectric, and that's how the brain and nervous system works. So it depolarizes using frequencies and electricity that come in very similar ranges to EMFs and Wi-Fi's. And so, I'd encourage your listeners to take a look at the work of Dr. Devra Davis and Dr. Magda Havas. Because they're leading this in North America, in my opinion.
I have two things before I want to let you go. One is a very selfish ask, and the second is I want you to tell me a bit more about your philanthropy. But before we talk about the philanthropy, I had braces on for a couple of years, and now I'm wearing plastic retainers during the night for a few hours. What are your thoughts on having plastic in your mouth? Is that something that I should be definitely not doing? I mean, you talked about maybe we all react differently to things, but
sure. Now, these are retainers, as in retaining the dental work.
Yes,
done, or they're not for bruxing. Okay, I have a bit of a concern with bruxing, retainers, because this is, creating a physiological advantage to your TMJ, and some people that grind their teeth. And that's, your jaw is strong, so sloughing these plasticizers and other chemicals off every night, all night, probably not a great thing. I would say it has so you'll learn this from Dr. Muhammad soon enough about your genetic susceptibility to detox and how, phase 1 and phase 2, you're able to throw away essentially these things that you're contending with, these plastics and xenoestrogens ultimately. I don't have much of a concern if they're just sitting there relatively inert. Certainly, the materials that are being used this day and age are not, of the soft plastics, that we had concerns about, the BPA's and all that. They've come to learn. Not to say that other things don't have other
Mm,
problems, but
mm.
if you're an optimal detoxifier, you have no problems with methylation. Or environmental toxins, and Dr. Mohammed will tell you this again. The methylation pathway is probably pretty important to acknowledge in this particular ask as well. I wouldn't be concerned.
Well, that's a question I should be making sure that I run by with.
Yeah, how good of a detoxifier are you, and
Yeah, yeah.
how good does your methylation pathway look? And if you again, I think guys that have the pathway, the hormonal pathway that supports evidence of them being an estrogen dominant male have a lot more to worry about when it comes to exposures to xenobiotics, which ultimately ramp up estrogen expression in the male body. So that's a whole conversation for you to be had with Dr. Mohammed. But I'm not concerned. I'd be more concerned about the amount of xenoestrogens you might be getting out of unfiltered water. I mean, I'd sooner probably encourage you to put a reverse osmosis unit on your house than I would try to get a zero plastic containing mouth implant.
Is that right? And what about if you're just buying your bottled water, the big Zephyl type bottles and things? Is that better, or you still think reverse osmosis?
Yeah, I still think RO. I think RO, especially in an individual who's got their diet in check, you're not getting organic minerals from water anyway. No. Certainly not at any levels your body needs. You'd have to drink a few Olympic swimming pools full to get the amount of organic calcium that your diet requires. So it's coming from your diet. You're getting enough, in supplement form, and on top of that, so you're not missing anything from RO. And number one rule about detoxification is to avoid the toxic exposure when possible in the first place, right?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yep. That makes sense. So reverse osmosis, everybody listening. Okay, before I let you go, mate, I've kept you a long time, but I want to know about your philanthropy, because you mentioned some of the places that you've been, but I think when you're there, you do some of these epic bikes and runs and everything, and you're working for a number of charities.
Yeah, well, I like to donate back to sick kids. And again, I'm very proud of the University Health Network that we have here in Toronto. It's one of the best in North America, one of the best in the world. Sick kids are flown in from all over the place. I mentioned the coastal challenge I did. I've cycled, 500 kilometers across Cuba over 4 days, raced 100-kilometer nonstop over 14 hours. And that was to raise money for Oxfam in that case, but regularly compete in marathons, half marathons. Now my favorite's been more the 10K distance, but, climbed Mount Kilimanjaro. Every time I do something like this, there's always a media tie-in. And then with that, I mentioned the philanthropic, in this case, sick kids, typically angle and do as best as I can to raise. Yeah, I mean, myself and my colleagues together, we've done over $1.5 million over the years, which is pretty.
Wow, congrats. Fantastic, mate. Good on you. And look, I just think anybody that wants to be able to follow you or get in touch with you, what's the best way? I'll put all of this in show notes again, but what's the best way?
Sure. I'd love them to check out my latest initiative, which is Brain Spanners. And so that's at brainspanners.com. So where, you mentioned at the very top, I believe, the notion of health span being a one-up on lifespan, which is obviously how many years we'll clock on the planet. But health span is how many years we'll live in optimal health, right? But we don't often think about the brain. And you can live in pretty decent physical health, but maybe experience the last 10 years of your life in cognitive decline. So Brain Spanners is all about living your longest, best life, lending a lot of what I've come to learn from the blue zones and centenarians, people that live beyond 100, but living your best life with full and optimal cognitive faculty. And so that's my latest book, Brain Spanners.
Fantastic.
Yeah. Otherwise, Wylde on Health, and you can get a whole 500,000 pages of free information on nutrition and supplements and all kinds of other stuff at Wylde, WYLDE on Health. Yeah.
Yep. I'll put that in there. And what about any social media? Are you on that?
Pretty much at Wylde on Health for most. Instagram and Twitter, and then it's Bryce Wylde at Facebook. But I love answering questions too. So if any of your viewers feel that they want to drop me a question on social media, I'm definitely happy to engage.
Oh, you're the best, mate. This has been absolutely fantastic. My brain is completely lit up right now. And I have 2 pages of notes here. Normally, I don't finish with so many. I'm scribbling the whole time you're writing there. Just so much knowledge. Obviously, I'm going to re-listen to this one several times. I can't thank you enough for coming on, mate. I really appreciate it. And, I thank everybody for listening. This has just been absolutely extraordinary. So thanks, mate.
Oh, hey, thanks so much, Greg. I appreciate everything that you're doing. And again, been wonderful chatting.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, stay on the line, and thanks everybody for listening.
Thanks a lot for listening to Be With Champions. If you've enjoyed the show, your support would truly be appreciated. You can visit the Be With Champions Patreon page, or you can subscribe with your podcast app of choice. Don't miss the next episode, so subscribe and be notified. For show notes, if you want to know more, please visit bennettendurance.com. I'm Phil Liggett, and on behalf of Greg Bennett, here's to the next time, and I hope you will join Greg again very soon.